Right, so thank you so much for being here with us today at Stowe School, and welcome obviously. And first off, I'd like to ask, what's your talk going to be about tonight? Why did you get into history? And yeah, more or less that's sort of the initial two questions I have for the moment.
Okay, thank you very much for the welcome. So my talk tonight is about witchcraft, not a how-to guide. It's about witch trials in the 16th and 17th centuries, or throughout history really, but there's this one period of history where the people who were persecuted as witches is particularly high in numbers. And so I'm going to be asking the question why that was. And how did I get into history? Well, like all the things we get into, really, it starts with a really good teacher. So I had really good history teachers at school, and that made me love the subject, and so I studied it at university. And as a result of that, I decided to, it was a bit of a roundabout way. One doesn't always find the path to your career immediately, but in the end decided to carry on and do further degrees and became a historian.
Oh, brilliant. Any questions?
So obviously you've written a lot of books and done programs and podcasts. So how do you go about kind of researching and starting a thing such as that?
Well, Felicity, so I have, you get a sort of an idea from reading. So quite often when you're reading around a subject, you start to see the gaps. You start to see where you think that the historians who've written about it so far have not had an approach that you might have, or look, there's a question that they've left unanswered, or something they've glossed over, and then you look around and say, oh, yeah, actually I feel like this is, we perhaps don't have as much information as we could have about this. And it's that question and that unique approach which each one of us brings to the study of history that gives us the research topic, that shows us the way to go, the thing that we should write about. And then you go off and spend a long time in the archives trying to substantiate it or trying to find any information that will give that answer. And if you're lucky, you find something good.
Yeah, talking of archives, so obviously before it came out, I sort of looked at the books that you've written, and one of them about the Voices of Nîmes, which you've recently published, and obviously it talks about the lives of women that would not have been recorded, and also and it's a form of social history. I was wondering whether how much did there's that book, I think, Montaillou by Leroy Ladurie, which is quite influential. I was wondering if it's about lives of women that weren't recorded, how did you go about collecting information, and how much effort was required to undertake what must have been quite a lengthy and complicated process?
Well, first of all, I'd like to compliment you on your accent. You're obviously francophone. The study of the women in Nîmes was based, so it was women who normally wouldn't have made it into the records,
right,
because this is a period of time where these women were illiterate, where they are, the women I was studying were not wealthy, so they mostly didn't leave wills, they don't have anything to leave. Under law, when they were married, they had no legal rights, so we don't see them appearing in court cases. But they appear in the records of the French Protestant church, the Huguenot church, because they're really committed to morality, and they believe that controlling morals means controlling women. So they pull these women before them and accuse them of generally, sexual crimes, but all sorts of misdemeanors. And the women explain themselves and do so by talking about their ordinary lives, what they were doing that day, and this happened and that happened and so on. And amazingly, in an era in which women's testimony is so often not recorded, these very patriarchal men of the consistory, the consistoire, which is the body that is enforcing morality, write down everything that they say. And so we have this amazing set of records that gives us an insight into lives of ordinary women. And so that's what I was drawing on. And I spent about a year in Nîmes, and there were other records in Paris and Montauban, and quite a lot of them I was photographing and then bringing back to read here. Yeah.
So, because you've obviously looked a lot into kind of the lives of women, would you say that your you often look at history with kind of a feminist point of view, and how would that affect how you were looking at the witch trials as well?
So from my perspective, feminism means just believing that there should be economic, social and political equality, which it doesn't feel like a great stretch, but at least one hopes. Though given what's happening in the world today, maybe that's a very naive thing to say. But in terms of it as an approach to history, my sense is that it means that I'm interested in telling the stories of women from the past, and I'm interested in their perspectives. And so that comes it's obvious in something like the Voices of Nîmes, because I'm talking about women's lives. But I think one can also find this I've written about Henry VIII, and actually it's quite interesting to take a perspective which elevates women's perspectives when it comes to Henry VIII, or the Tudor court, and it's just trying to listen out for those points of view, those experiences that perhaps haven't been the forefront of narratives in the past.
Yeah, talking of Henry VIII, which I think you've researched into, and the sort of narratives and the lives of women. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about, for example, Anne Boleyn? I think it was because there was I think you read a book maybe, or
I wrote a book about 1536, which was the year in which Anne Boleyn died, and have otherwise written.
So what was the significance, and maybe are there multiple narratives that maybe recent historians have discovered, or maybe have put more emphasis on, that maybe like looks at a different point of view?
So Anne Boleyn was executed in 1536, the 19th of May, on charges of adultery, incest, and conspiring the king's death. She was Henry VIII's second wife, and the one he had moved heaven and hell to be with, because he had changed pretty much the face of the country in order to marry her, broken with the Church of Rome, put aside his first wife of 20 or plus years, and then 3 years into the marriage he has her executed. So the question has been why. And so historians have looked at the evidence and come to various conclusions. Henry VIII was a monster, just like cutting off people's heads. It's a conspiracy. She was guilty. Or my reading of the evidence is sort of cock-up version of history. It's like something went horribly wrong. So I explore that, because I don't think in the end, I'm not convinced in the end that it's a conspiracy against her, which is, I suppose, been the dominant story until now. So what I found was very interesting in that, and I've also worked on the end of Henry VIII's life, is you take what's the accepted orthodoxy, and you say, well, let's go and have a look at the evidence again. Let's see if it stacks up.
Have you ever, sorry to interrupt, but have you ever engaged in arguments with other historians that might have about contested sort of view, and maybe had a historical spat, so to speak?
In a very civilized way.
Right, okay.
No green ink, but just through the printed word. One has to do it with great respect, though, because generally speaking, one is building on the work of these other historians anyway. I think when, as a young historian, you tend to be so keen to prove yourself that actually it's full of storm and drang, and you keep saying, oh, this person is wrong and this person is wrong, and over time you realise that how much one draws on other people's work all the time, and that we're all human, and just being a little more humble about it is the way to go, really. Right. I mean, it's entirely possible that I'm completely wrong, and probably it will be disproved very soon. And that's history. It's iterations, it's interpretations.
So based on that, and kind of the fact that there are lots of different readings, would you say that there's ever a point where kind of you've completed every reading about history and there's kind of nothing more to learn about a situation? Or could you just continue finding different ways to look at it forever?
I think you know the answer to this. But I think that the answer is, well, for a start, there's always the possibility of new evidence. But even when there's not new evidence, there are new ways of reading the evidence, and there are new perspectives we bring. People who are reading history today, who are starting out on their careers as historians today, come with a different set of life experiences, a different set of perspectives. The 21st century is asking different questions of the sources than people who were writing about it in the 1970s. And so my sense is that every new person who studies history brings to it their own perspective, which means that they can see something in the sources that no one else has ever seen. And that's totally thrilling.
So, in light of what you just said, do you think there can ever be a level of objectivity with historians in terms of history? Because obviously, if it's interpretations and new evidence, is there some sort of objectivity?
I think we now recognise that we all bring our subjectivities to the writing of history, but I don't think that means that we have to give up and down tools. I think we need to try and get as close as we can to objectivity, which means that we're trying to see our own biases, we're trying to see what it is we're bringing to texts, we're trying to have as much moral integrity when we're handling sources as possible. We don't allow assumption creep, we don't construct castles in the air, and we use sources and context and all that sort of stuff. There are good and bad ways of writing history. But I think that to think that any of us ever quite achieve objectivity is delusional, but that doesn't mean we don't keep trying.
Right, okay.
Would you say, sorry, this is slightly kind of new direction, but can you draw any parallels and similarities or differences, from what you've read in history and now, or society now, and can you compare them? Or, are there quite a lot of similarities?
I mean, in so many ways. One of the things I'll be talking about today in the witchcraft, this is a very obvious one, there are so many more subtle things one could say, but people around the world are being tried as witches today. And we think of this as being something that is absolutely in the distant past. And interestingly, actually, even in the 16th and 17th centuries, largely 17th century, the witch trials were a product of a shift towards modernity. They're kind of the birth pangs of capitalism, among other things. And today we see accusations of people as witches around the world. So just extrapolate from that for a second, let's think about how we treat people who are other than ourselves. That's what witches are ultimately. They're the outcasts, they're the outsiders, they're the people it's easy to pick on. And my sense is that there's very strong lessons in there for us today.
Yeah.
With that witchcraft, are there also cases in the West? Because where does it happen predominantly? Because that's a new piece of information, just given that there's women around the world and people tried for witchcraft.
And not just women, but children quite often as well. I mean, most of these are not in Western societies, although there was a famous case in London, but it involved a Congolese couple. But yes, I mean, all over the world, Indonesia, India, Nigeria, Papua New Guinea, you name the places these accusations are happening. I won't go into it in great depth because I'm mostly talking about the 16th and 17th centuries. But I think it's very interesting to bear in mind, one, the actual fact of witch trials around the world today, and two, what does it mean when you pick on a person and say they're other to you? Because that's the story of history, actually, is whether you say, oh, someone's a leper, or they're Jewish, or they're a witch. It's choosing somebody and saying that they don't belong. And we've done that for a lot of history, and I think it doesn't take much imagination to think of exact parallels in society today.
Maybe as a final question, do you have any? It's quite general, but because you're a professional historian, what sort of advice would you give to an aspiring historian, or a compelling argument, or any suggestions as to why you should get into history or further your studies into this field?
Well, I suggest history is the study of everything that ever happened. So it is enormously capacious as a subject, available for, it's so exciting. Whatever interest you have, whatever take you want, it's a wonderful thing to study. It involves the use of critical thinking. You really have to be able to think to be a good historian. You have to be able to assess evidence. And frankly, if you study history at university, you're then prepared for pretty much any job that involves using your brain. But if you want to be a good historian, if you want to be a historian, you're thinking about it, that's where you start, really. You start with reading and you start with thinking. You read a book by a historian, you think, am I convinced by what they say? Has the evidence they adduce proved the point they're saying it proves? Where do I see the flaws and the gaps? And once you start thinking into those inconsistencies and those spaces, then you can start to assess how well that history is being written.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
And wonderful questions.
Yes, thank you.